That little girl wasn't racist. Her parents may have been, and she may have learned that behavior from them and learned certain ideas from them, and that's what makes it systemic and hegemonic and a paradigm. It makes it a way of understanding the world, a way of being in the world, and also very hard to change.
The sharp division of people into two main groups.
If more colored are allowed to move in, Levittown is going to go downhill.
If a kid acts out in school, we change suspension to incarceration.
For everybody who ignores this is something that happens every single day.
This is your police department in review.
Decades of housing discrimination. We have gone backwards since the civil rights era.
My first experience with systemic racism was probably when I was 7. We lived in Florida at the time, and we lived in a very white neighborhood, and there was a family a couple doors down from us in the place that we lived, and they would not let the two little kids play with me or my brothers. So that was weird, right? And when we finally did get a chance to play with the kids, the little girl asked if my skin washed off, like if it came off. And I didn't understand. I was like, huh? And later, like years later, I was recalling that experience to someone else, and they said, oh, their family was probably racist. And I still didn't understand, because I was maybe like 14 or something, but it never left me. It always stuck with me. And maybe leaving Florida, when I was headed for New York after college, still had that experience. And that's a very like grainy kind of remembrance of it. It's not as sharp as it used to be. That family had further become like overtly discriminatory and racist to like other folks in the neighborhood. We had since moved from the neighborhood, but other folks who we were around still kind of recalled their, oh yeah, you used to live next to so-and-so, oh, they were really racist, blah, blah, blah. So those are kind of my first experiences with kind of like this overarching idea of racism, that it wasn't personal. I think it was just the way that, it was personal because it, affected me, but it wasn't personal in that I was a kid. So what makes it systemic in that instance, right? Because that little girl wasn't racist. Her parents may have been, and she may have learned that behavior from them and learned certain ideas from them, and that's what makes it systemic and hegemonic and a paradigm. It makes it a way of understanding the world, a way of being in the world, and also very hard to change. It permeates everything. It doesn't just stop with the parents. And I think that's what's really dangerous about people saying things like, oh, well, the racists are gonna die off. No, we have to be on a constant re-education campaign, because folks are ingraining this in their kids, whether it's a parallel curriculum, like I like to call it as an educator, or the actual curriculum of what they're teaching their kids. So whether it's this kind of shadow curriculum or it's an actual, hey, listen, you have to treat certain people this way, it's being taught either way. So have to be on this constant re-education campaign. Systemic racism speaks to, again, not only a system, but a way of thinking, and a structure. So we're thinking, when we say systemic racism, we're thinking about laws that are put into place. We're thinking about policies that are made at city and state and neighborhood levels. We're thinking about language that goes into company disciplinary documents to help shape how they want their employees to behave. We're thinking system level, right? When we say systemic. And why is it systemic? Because it's almost self-perpetuating. So once you put a policy or a practice or a law into works, it almost works automatically because folks accept it as normal. They don't really challenge it. And it becomes a system that seemingly is operating automatically, but we know it's people pushing it on, but they're doing so because they are not challenging, nor are they taught to challenge, nor is the challenge accepted to kind of challenge those systems that are put into place, policy, law, these kinds of things. Now, when we talk about, let's say someone is exhibiting racist behavior, is that systemic racism? I say it derives from systemic racism because you, as an individual person, cannot enact an entire system, but you can depend on the system in order to kind of understand and carry out your own behavior as an individual person, So while all individual behaviors are not systemic, folks can hearken back to the system in order to rely on and be affirmed by a system that will enable their racist behavior. And that is why Ibram X. Kendi, I didn't like the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, but the concepts in the book are fabulous because he develops a way of thinking about racism that's really important. He talks about being anti-racist, the work, having anti-racist thinking and anti-racist behaviors versus just calling somebody a racist, right? Because when we call somebody a racist, it's, people are offended, even though I think some people are actually racist, but another story. But when we call somebody a racist, it doesn't really get at the heart of what is racist, right? Because people will tell you in a second, well, I'm not racist, I have black friends. Well, maybe that part isn't racist, but what about these other behaviors that are? And I think Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, gets at that idea. You have to practice anti-racist behavior, and we all can challenge ourselves, whether we are, no matter what race we ascribe to work towards anti-racist behavior. So some examples of anti-racist behavior can be, depending on what your station is in the community, whether you ascribe to the dominant culture or whether you are of a minority population, your anti-racist behavior can be calling out certain policies or procedures that you see as not benefiting the community in an equitable way. For example, if you know that a bank lender, for example, has historically had an issue with lending to populations equally, gathering a community group to find out why, because they're supposed to serve the community and serve the community equitably, and finding out what that is. That's attacking anti-racist behavior. Challenging how your friends speak. If you have a friend who is constantly saying they're uncomfortable around minorities, challenge them and find out why. If they're constantly talking over minorities when they're telling them their issue or their pain or their suffering, challenge them and find out why. Because a lot of racism and racist behavior is covert. It's not it's covert, it's learned and it's ingrained and it becomes a part of us in a way that it feels really hard and cutting for somebody to be like, you're a racist. It feels really hard and was traumatic. It's not as traumatic as, actually experiencing racism, I will say. However, it is still a level of trauma that people are experiencing when, people call them racist. Anti-racist examples I also harken back to is thinking. So like, if I'm challenging my own thinking to this kind of like introspective way of challenging yourself is also important. If I, I'll just, pick on white folks for a second. If I'm white in a community, how am I understanding my relationship to the minority persons in my community, the people who serve me, the people who historically, particularly in Harrisburg, are cleaning, serving me at the hospital, serving me in different places? How do I understand my relationship to them? How do I interact with them? And challenging any kinds of preconceived notions I have about who these people are in my community. So there's lots I could go on about this, but there's lots of different ways to challenge anti-racist thinking and anti-racist behaviors. One of my favorites is with tone policing. When you tone police someone, especially as somebody in the dominant culture, how do you think that tone policing is being perceived? And Are you attacking the person because of who they are and not because of their message? There's a ton we can do. So yes, there are tons of ways to kind of pinpoint anti-racist behaviors. And it's not enough to be like, I'm not racist. This is something that Ibram X. Kendi goes over in his book, and a couple of people, Dr. Amanda Camp and a couple other folks. But they go over this kind of work. It's not enough to be like, well, I'm not racist, because that takes the onus off of you to be actively working towards eradicating racism in the community. So it's not enough. It's not enough just to say, well, I'm not racist, so I don't have to worry about it. No. You have to eradicate it in the community. You have to look at the structures. You have to look at the rules. You have to look at the different things that are happening. And as Al Sharpton said when I was like, how old am I now? So like maybe when I was like 10, he said something. He was doing some activism work in Brooklyn, and he said he's a prolific preacher. If you have time, just go look on YouTube and just look at some Al Sharpton speeches. They're amazing, especially in his early days. But he said something important. He said, when you lift up, Black and brown people in the community, you lift everybody up. So if we're working towards anti-racism, we're lifting up the whole community, because you will effectively be working towards any other kind of discrimination as well, like working towards rooting that out when you are focusing on eradicating anti-racist behavior. You can also go to anti-sexist behavior. You can also go to people who have disabilities, people who treat them differently because they have a disability. So when you start kind of examining that, the hope is, and it is in practice as well, that you'll start seeing other areas of discrimination and calling those out, anti-LGBTQ behavior and all these other different kinds of antis that there are, that you'll start to call that out and uplift the entire community. So that's the goal. I came from Brooklyn to State College in 2009. I had just come off of the Obama campaign, 2010, because I had just come off the Obama campaign. I got accepted to school for the fall of 2008, but opted to go work on the campaign in Philadelphia. And then I came to State College. And the experiences are interesting with experiencing kind of a systemic racism, because some of it is like, in retrospect, you realize it. You don't realize it while it's happening to you. You think it's the system. You don't think it's racist. You don't think it's targeted towards you particularly. So you don't realize it. So some of the things that, became blatantly clear with particular racist behavior, particularly working on the campaign, was the efforts to disenfranchise Black voters in Philadelphia. Clear as day. They targeted Black and brown voters with letters and told them they couldn't vote, when it was clearly, we had to do so much work in my 2 wards around alerting these voters that the letters they were receiving was not true, but they weren't getting those letters 2 neighborhoods over. They weren't getting them in West Falls. They weren't getting them in certain places. They weren't getting door knockers on their doors with incorrect voter polling place information. It was targeted towards these communities. So the work that we had to do to make sure that these Black and brown folks, Black and Hispanic folks in North Philadelphia, that they actually didn't believe the targeted messages that were put at them, was enormous. It took up so much of our time. That's racism, plain and simple to me. When you know that you can target a group of Black and brown voters to disenfranchise their vote, that's racism to me. So that's 1. 2, going into grad school. Grad school was interesting because at Penn State, Maine, grad school is overwhelmingly white and Asian. There's very few Black people. And the racism that I saw there was particularly towards the Asian students. Lots of comments about why they even got into grad school if they couldn't speak English, why they were accepting so many Asians, and how that was disenfranchising Pennsylvanians. But what was interesting enough, that Pennsylvanian population never included native native Pennsylvanians that were African American. It only ever included another population, the dominant culture population, white people. That only became clear to me after I started working in a neighborhood organization, helping the spouses of international graduate students shore up their English, because that was the kind of xenophobia and racism that they received. They received this, well, you can't even speak English, so why are you here? And I can understand you. People who had been speaking English since kindergarten, all of a sudden they come to the United States and nobody can understand them in the places where they live. Like, it was very insidious, but outrageous too, like both. So working with them and a lot of my work was not teaching them English because they knew English. That's the first thing I realized when I started teaching them. They knew English already. So I was like, oh, so what are we working on? I had to kind of like they were working, they had to kind of like reassess. They needed to know how to break through that xenophobia. That's what they were trying to do. They needed to know how to break through that cultural racism that they were experiencing and didn't know how to name. And even in retrospect, I didn't know yet. I was teaching them cultural things, thinking I was just helping them, but really that's what they were trying to do. They're trying to break through that. I wrote a research paper on international graduate student spouses and their experiences in grad school because of that work, of working in this community agency. And it was then I started realizing their experience. Tell me about your experience. Tell me how you felt. A lot of them would say, in my country, I was a diplomat or a lawyer or a business person or all these different things. And I come here and I'm nothing. And it's systemic because in a couple of different ways. One, the visa that they come on, the spouse visa, the nickname for that is the dead body visa. And they call it the dead body visa because they only can come here as a spouse. They cannot do anything else in this society. So that already puts them down a rung in their own minds because they're coming from these very complicated, rich lives to literally sit in the house here or go to Starbucks, possibly. Those are a couple of the experiences that I had. So I could go on about that because that's very interesting to me. And then just as being a grad student in State College, being told, it was so funny. It went from like, are you sure you're cut out for this program, by the person who actually ended up being my advisor, to her wanting to work with me on every single, wanted me to be on all her papers, wanted to work, have me on her projects, because, she realized much later, but it took her several years to kind of realize my worth as a grad student in the program. It took her quite some time. And these are from people who are pretty liberal. These are from people we're experiencing these things from folks that consider themselves super liberal. And another interesting experience I had with kind of what I like to call intellectual racism is we were doing this project here in Harrisburg, and this is before I knew anything about Harrisburg, but we were coming to do a project here. And we were doing it on how parents perceived autism in their children and whether they got help or kind of like attention issues in their children, not even autism or ADHD yet, but how they perceived attention issues in their kids and what they were doing to kind of help their kids. And there was a kerfuffle over food. One of the community kind of connectors alerted the research team that was coming in, that they should bring certain kinds of food for the folks. If they're going to bring certain kinds of food, bring this kind of food. It was like dinner food. It was like chicken and beans and like juice and stuff. So one of the times, the primary investigator on the project did just completely disregarded the community food needs and was like, I'm bringing this. And so when we asked her why, she said, well, I was just watching out because I know that there's diabetes in the Black community. This is a white woman. And I said, I'm on the email because she copies me on the email to kind of back her up. And I'm like, no. So I take the other person off the email. I was like, no. I said, if you ask somebody what they want to eat, which you did, and they tell you what they want to eat, I'm not sure why you think it's appropriate to then say, because of diabetes in the Black community, I'm bringing you Simply Lemonade instead. I'm not sure I'm not sure why that's appropriate. And I kind of pushed back on her for that because she copied me on the email as her Black backup. And I was like, no, let's take this person off the email and let's deal with why you think it's appropriate to approach a community that way. And she ended up saying, I'm very glad that you were here. I had you to bounce this off of because I didn't know that was racially insensitive. And I was like, yeah, it's racially insensitive to say those kinds of things and assume something because you know of a statistic that may not even apply to the community. Yes, it's pretty racially insensitive. And steeped in this kind of, it's a different system, but a systemic ways of understanding Black people. They have, there's a lot of diabetes in the Black community, so, that's what we know about them kind of idea, instead of interrogating kind of our assumptions. So those are a couple things. I run a Facebook group called The Movement. A friend of mine, Brent, and I, we both run it. And one of our rules in the group is don't talk over Black people. Black people get talked over in every other space. Don't come here and talk over Black people. Listen to what Black folks have to listen to them. Talk to them. Don't talk over them. So no amount of don't talk over Black people to the folks who consider themselves liberal and white and down for the cause and Black Lives Matter, hashtag Black Lives Matter, works for some reason. If they are intent in talking over you, they will talk over you and tell you how to lead, tell you how to run things, no matter what. Like, it doesn't matter what you do. So we had this guy say, Black Lives Matter, but all racism is bad, and you guys need to call out all racism. Yes, I understand that you are experiencing discrimination as a white male in America. Don't even get me started on that. I understand that you're experiencing this, what you perceive as racism, but this particular group in this particular space is not for that. No, that doesn't work. It doesn't work when you as a leader, a Black or brown leader of a group, tries to set parameters and set boundaries. No, that is not what you should do. You should listen to us because you should be for all people. And I literally had to be like, you have to go. Like, if you are not about this cause and you're not about listening to Black and brown leaders in the community and understanding how they're asking you to help in the movement, then this is not the group for you. Go to the next group where they will take that. But more than anything, center Black voices in a Black movement. And this has been the big push in the last couple of weeks for us. Like, center Black and brown voices in a Black and brown movement. Do not come into a Black and brown space and try to tell them how they should do things from your perspective. You have every other part of the community to do that, and not here and not today. So we've experienced that a lot, like this kind of like idea that, folks they know best and will not listen to Black and brown leaders no matter what. And it's disheartening, but to that I'm just like, I know you're liberal, I know you mean well, but the other piece of this work is not centering yourself in the middle of the conversation every single time. And while I wouldn't call that the most overt kind of racism in the world, it's very harmful and it's very racially insensitive, especially when you're told. It becomes completely overt when you're asked and told several times not to do it, and you do it anyway. And like with my professor, like if I would have told her that was racially insensitive, and she was like, well, I'm still bringing this other food because Black people need to not eat that stuff, that would have been pretty horrible. And that's what keeps happening in our group. Like, no matter how we say, let Black folks lead, let us let you know how we need the help, let us let you know what needs to be done. No, we know better than you, and now you're discriminating against me because you're telling me that I'm wrong, which is completely outrageous and completely performative and just counterproductive to everything. But that's the kind of stuff you come up against that's steeped in kind of racist values and steeped in a dominant culture worldview that doesn't get called out enough. It just doesn't get called out enough. So we have a lot, especially in the last, what day are we on, 27? On the 27th, since May 30th, to now, from the first protest at the Capitol steps to now, the very first one that Harrisburg had in this season, to now, it's been a lot of that. It's been a lot of kind of sussing out the folks who want to come in and tell you how to lead and draw attention back to this dominant culture perspective that's steeped in racism that nobody wants to interrogate. And we've had to do a lot of like cutting away to get out of that. Tone policing is right off the bat a kind of ad hominem attack. It's a logical fallacy kind of attack. So that's where we're going to place it in like the grander scheme of things. But it's particularly used against people when you don't like their message, but you can't attack the message itself. So you attack the tone, and you attack the way somebody said it, or you ascribe a way to how it's said and then say that was the way it was said. So tone policing is part of how respectability politics plays out in the Black community as well, where you have to be respectable, make sure that you're doing everything right, make sure you're speaking a certain way, make sure you're dressed a certain way, make sure you look a certain way in order to be accepted and for your message to be accepted. So to all that, I say, boo, because the work that it takes to be respectable so that you won't get tone policed takes away from everything you're trying to do. And to me, it's worse than actually coming straight out and being like, hey, this is harmful, please don't do that. And then having the person go, oh, well, your message might be good, but I don't like the way you said that to me. You need to watch how you talk to me, kind of thing. There's a certain level of gaslighting as well in tone policing, because sometimes no matter how you say it, the person's gonna take it as an attack. I had someone just yesterday tell me I belittled her. It wasn't racism in like the kind of way. I asked her not to call the police about a very minor issue, and the person who committed the minor issue to her was another white person, white woman, white man, did something minor. And she was upset with me because I told her that calling the police, it was problematic that she would contact the police about this issue, this very small thing. And to her, it was a really big deal. She posted about it in a couple places. And so when I went to tell her that, so there were several people who told her, and that was the other weird thing about this thread. There were several white people who also told her, listen, you probably shouldn't do that as well. But she came after me, and she was pointed in her attack. When I wouldn't I wouldn't let up off the point of, no, you should definitely not call the police for minor things like this, no matter who the person is. There are other ways to handle it. She then said, well, thank you for your education, but you need to consider your tone. So nothing about my message, nothing about what I said, completely disregarded actually a lot of the other things I said to come back and double back and tell me about the tone. That's literally tone policing. One of the things that's difficult about working with certain folks in the dominant culture is they say things like, well, that was not my intention. I understand, but the way that it plays out in real life and the way that it's actually enacted is harmful and hurtful. And when you say that back to somebody's intention, they go, stop being mean to me. That hurts my feelings because you are now attacking my intentions. And I'm like, I understand that may hurt your feelings. It hurts my feelings. People tell me things that I do aren't great. Absolutely. Did I mean it that way? No. But you not meaning it that way doesn't change the outcome of the situation. And you need to examine that. And you don't need to back away from that to double back and attack the person who called out your problematic behavior. And that's that tone policing and gaslighting. There's, like I said, a level of gaslighting too, because they make the situation seem like it was never them who did anything wrong, and your tone is the complete and total problem. And if you would just fix that, then everybody would be able to be happy. I am hopeful for the future. I actually was discussing with a couple friends and my therapist, because it's really important to have a therapist during times like this that you can trust, that it is a difficult time, it's a hard time, but it gives me a certain amount of hope for the future. I actually just wrote a small piece in the Berg for this too, just talking about how there's joy in justice, and there's justice in joy too, and being hopeful and joyful that there is a better community in the future that I'm working towards now, and that there are better outcomes for everyone in the community, particularly folks who are under a lot of duress, particularly our marginalized communities, and those who are on the margins of the margins, like Black trans men and women, for example, that there is a better community ahead. But we have to do the work now. We have to do the work now. And that work includes trying to bolster community relations through discussion, absolutely, but also just calling those things like they are, and making sure that we employ, I don't know what word I'm thinking of, but bring along as many people of the dominant culture as possible who are truly about the work too. Because as I've told so many people, yes, of course, well, you don't want any white people in here? No, we absolutely need white people everywhere, obviously, because we cannot end systemic racism without white folks. We cannot end discrimination of any kind without every part of the community involved in that work. And to go a step further, having people who inherit a system of racism and systemic racism, who inherit structural benefits from that system, it's on them to do the work to dismantle that system. Like, that's the work. Two things locally that we're trying to work on is a police review board, a Harrisburg Bureau of Police Review Board. And then we're also trying to work on initiatives on how we interact with the police as a community. So trying to hit that from both ends. That's something I think will not just be a reactive solution to what's happening around the country, but a proactive solution going forward. And then a couple other things we're doing is just doing leadership workshops, particularly the YPOC. We're just doing leadership workshops on how people can get involved in the community. So the number one question we've had on our inbox, messages, my personal email, our YPOC email, my work email, every way that folks can contact us is, what can I do? And most of the questions are coming from folks of the dominant culture. What can I do? What can I do? And so, part of what we believe our work is to identify those initiatives and say, here's what you can do. Here's what you can do to help. Here's what you can do in the community. Here's how you interact with community organizations. Here's how you can fund them. Here's how you can do these things so that you're affecting positively, not just reacting when a Black or brown life is murdered, right? But because their lives should not only matter in death. Black life matters from the beginning all the way through to the end. So let's attack some of the systemic and community issues we're seeing at those levels too. Let's talk about leadership. Let's talk about how we're going to college. Let's talk about school support. Let's talk about food insecurity. Let's talk about how we turn parts of Harrisburg, away from being a food desert. Let's talk about some of those things. And let's, if you guys are mobilized, here are the initiatives. How do we organize around them? Mobilize, organize, and some other stuff.